If I may, I would just like to welcome everyone to this event this morning. So hello, good morning and welcome from me. I'm Ian Gray, I chair the Egyptian-British Chamber of Commerce here in the UK. And we've been organising the conference this week in partnership and with a great deal of input from the British Egyptian Business Association in Cairo. We are the two bilateral business organisations, and we have worked together to get this off the road. The chairman of BEBA is introducing some of the sessions, and I'm introducing some of the others. This is day 2 of our conference this week. It's a virtual conference. And we're presenting really an overview of Egypt and its green economy. And I think one of the things that we're certainly learning as we do more of these over time is that for those of us who go to conferences, we go partly to hear the presentations and discussions, but we also go to meet people with the same interests. And that's obviously much harder in the virtual world. So one of the things that we have now introduced is a platform called the Trade Accelerator. The Chamber of Commerce in the UK has done it in association with BEBA, with the Egyptian Business Association, the Egyptian Junior Business Association. We've launched a platform called the Trade Accelerator, which is in effect somewhere where 24/7 you can wander into corridors or have a coffee break and meet people with a similar interest. But back to the formal agenda for today. Our session this morning is to cover economic diplomacy, shifting mindsets, multilateralism, all towards a sustainable, green and resilient economy. We are very fortunate today to have as our keynote speaker, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation. Minister, thank you so much for finding the time to be here today and contributing to organising this. And the whole session is going to be moderated by Lutfi Siddiqui, who is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. So I'm going to step back now and leave it to Lutfi to introduce the panel. But thank you again, Minister, for coming today and contributing to the conference this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good morning, good afternoon to people who are joining us from both Europe and Asia. My name is Lutfi Siddiqui. I'm sitting here in Singapore right now, very excited to listen to and participate in this session on shifting mindsets through economic diplomacy. I think all 3 words, shifting, mindsets, and diplomacy, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm really looking forward to that. And we have a very distinguished panel of 3, and I'll go to that straight away. All I want to say before that is that this is meant to be interactive, so please use the Q&A button and we'll try and bring your questions in as much as possible. If I could introduce our keynote speaker, Her Excellency the Minister. Dr. Rania Al-Mashat is Minister of International Cooperation of Egypt. She's been in that post since December of last year, and before that, she was Europe's Minister of Tourism. In her current role, she oversees an active partnerships portfolio exceeding $25 billion and is responsible for engagements, bilateral and multilateral, with development partners, private sector, civil society, all stakeholders to help deliver the national economic agenda, which is in turn consistent with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Al-Mashat, as Minister of Tourism, embarked on a reform program, which by the time she left seems to have had incredible success. The revenue from the tourism sector grew by 66% from $7 billion to $13 billion by the time she left the ministry in December of last year. It's a great vision to execution story. Amongst many of the accolades and awards to her name, she is the 2014 member of the Young Global Leaders Community of the World Economic Forum. She received a PhD and MA from UMCP and her BA in economics from the American University in Cairo. And people would be familiar with her background previously with the central bank and with the IMF in senior roles as an economist. So without further ado, Dr. Al-Mashat, ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lutfi, and I'm very happy to join both Jürgen from EBRD and Eric from AIIB and you in Singapore. And if we're talking about multilateralism, this is multilateralism across borders. You're in Singapore, we have Eric in Beijing, we have Jürgen in London, and myself in Cairo. So I think the mindset has already shifted, and that we are able, all of us, to convene to discuss what is extremely important, which is green recovery and so forth. Let me just start by explaining why and what are the principles of economic diplomacy. Of course, when I took on this job in December, everybody was looking at 2020 as a year where many things were going to take off. And suddenly, everybody has been pushed to the limits with the pandemic. And this required a renewed sense of cooperation, an urgent sense of collaboration with different development partners, with different private sector entities, with different civil society. And when we talk about the role of the Ministry of International Cooperation, and I say that we are responsible for Egypt's economic diplomacy, there are three key principles. One of them is, or the first one is multi-stakeholder platforms, where we convene all development partners with line ministries to basically provide what has happened in their sector, and also what is the vision going forward, and how we can create synergies and complementarity between different financing or technical assistance, help or support from different development partners. The second principle has to do with the ODA SDG mapping, and this is extremely important. One of the key downside risks of the pandemic was our countries going to be derailed from their SDG agenda. And what is extremely important is how can we take a look at existing portfolio, development assistance portfolio, map them to the SDGs, so that going forward, as we are approaching 2030, now 9.5 years or maybe 10 years are ahead of us, what is the type of financing that we need in order to close these gaps? And then the third principle is global partnerships narrative. How can we all gather together and have a narrative that discusses what a country has been doing? In our case, our narrative that we chose is people and projects and purpose, people at the core and projects in action and purpose as the driver. And I keep on saying this, it's a very good year to be representing Egypt globally. Whether it was at the EBRD annual meetings or the World Bank annual meetings, Egypt is singled out as a country with positive growth rates in 2020, and also expectations of growth rate in 2021, actually approaching 5% in 2021. What does this what is the basis of this? The basis of this are actually very important reforms that took place between 2016, 2019 on the monetary and fiscal side, but also a very clear vision on how we need to move forward when it comes to infrastructure, when we need to look at sector reforms in education, social solidarity, and many others. And this is truly what helped us enter 2020 with a very strong footing. And what is even more compelling is that we continued the reform process in 2020 and have an outlook for 2021. The topic of the discussion is the green recovery. All of us know that we have been actually creating fiscal stimulus in order to push GDP going forward and create that economic activity and employment. And what was very significant on the green side, when you look at the case of Egypt, is that 30% of all investment projects had to comply with certain environmental criteria. This is something that the government announced. Something else, and this was for the first time ever in the Middle East, we have issued green bonds just last month. They started with 500 million. The demand was up to 4 billion. So we ended up with 750 billion with respect to that. If we take a look at the EBRD's strategy for the next 4 years, and as governor of Egypt at EBRD, we were discussing this during the annual meetings. The focus is on green recovery, digitalization, and women empowerment. And on these three key agendas, Egypt is doing a lot. On the green recovery, I talked a little bit. When it comes to digital, there is a very ambitious reform program on education. that actually helped us face the pandemic by online schooling. And this is continuing to actually support an upgraded skill set for students so that they can face going forward a different type of market demand as we all are witnessing. And then the third has to do with gender. And Egypt is the first country in Africa and the Middle East to actually launch Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator. It's Ministry of International Cooperation, National Council for Women with the World Economic Forum. And actually, we're one of the first countries to have a policy tracker during the pandemic, which is gender related. And we got first place in West Asia and the Middle East with 21 policy measures related to trying to mitigate the impact on women. So I will stop here. I just wanted to provide a basis to say that we have proven through different aspects during the pandemic that there's great resilience for the Egyptian economy. Reform happened before, and we were not derailed by the pandemic. On the contrary, we continued to push ahead on different fronts, and this is something that will go going forward. Again, we are trying to push economic diplomacy through the 3 principles that I mentioned, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think what will be really encouraging for the business audience that you have here is the focus on execution. You mentioned a policy tracker, you mentioned very key identifiable KPIs, and that really is very heartening to see that it's not just vision and mission, it's very much execution focused. Our next speaker is Mr. Jürgen Richtering, EBRD First Vice President and Head of Client Services Group. Mr. Richtering oversees the Client Services Group, which is comprised of the banking, policy and partnership departments. He has overall responsibility for implementation of banking and policy objectives, ensuring that investments, engagements and advisory, they all deliver the maximum impact in the countries where EBRD operates. From July to November of 2020, so really this month, Mr. Richtering was also the acting president of EBRD, running the bank in the interim period. Before he came to EBRD in 2018, Mr. Richtering was the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Management Board of FMO, the Dutch Development Bank. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Lutfi, for your kind and long introduction. And good morning, Your Excellency, Dr. Rania. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of EBRD, I'm of course truly honored to join you today for this session. Like all of you, I'm of course encouraged by the latest developments and yesterday's news that an effective vaccine can perhaps be rolled out before long. But ladies and gentlemen, it will still be a long time before the majority of people have received the vaccine. And any vaccine will certainly not make a difference to the current wave. Therefore, I believe we need to remain alert and cautious. I realize I almost sound like a politician right now, but in fact, as the virus continues to spread rapidly, many economies in the world are again facing serious disruption. And the long-term consequences of the current crisis still are only unfolding. So therefore, I believe that we have at least 3 immediate challenges ahead of us. First, supporting the economic recovery. Second, building back better. And thirdly, combating climate change. So let me start with the recovery. The pandemic has led to an unprecedented drop in global GDP. What is more, it has forced governments to intervene in the economy like never before. There will be short-term and long-term consequences, some of which we are discussing, by the way, today in our latest EBRD transition report, which we are launching today and which I, of course, highly recommend, and I'm sure Eric as well for that matter. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis has exposed how well different countries are equipped.
Oh, is it just me, or has Jürgen frozen for everyone else as well?
Jürgen has frozen for me.
Okay. Should we give it a few seconds to see if that changes? Otherwise, Jürgen, are you back?
I think I'm back. Sorry for that.
Yes, that's all right.
Technique.
We lost you just after the EBRD transition report.
Okay, then let me then just start. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis has exposed how well different countries are equipped to deal with such a massive blow. Some countries had resources and reserves to resort to, while others benefited from being embedded in bigger alliances like the European Union. Egypt also felt a severe impact of the crisis, not the least because of the collapse in tourism, but was one of the few countries, as Dr. Rania already mentioned, that avoided what the economists call a recession. In its anti-crisis measures, the country could rely on institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, or, of course, the EBRD. For other countries, however, the opposite was true. The pandemic has forced many governments, especially in the developing world and emerging markets, into a painful financial stretch. As a consequence, in the coming years, public support for the economy will remain needed most where it is least available. This is the first illustrations where multilateral development institutions have a crucial role to play, where capacity and resources are in short supply or are missing for that matter. We must step in and we must step up. If the coronavirus pandemic has not alerted us to the existence of global threats and to the fact that they can only be addressed with global responses, nothing will. Second, building back better. The massive financial intervention to counter the impact of the coronavirus means that resources will be much scarcer for many years to come. This is a challenge, but we must learn to turn it to our advantage. As the old saying has it, necessity begets ingenuity. We need to be smarter, and we must address issues that have been left unresolved for far too long. The question, therefore, is how we can build a sustainable recovery. One that combines growth with the Sustainable Development Goals, one that fast-tracks lessons from the crisis, like, for instance, the reorientation of supply chains to secure vital supplies, or the future of work, of the impact of digitalization on the economy. Inclusive engagement is needed indeed to build back better. We urgently need to mobilize the private sector to support green recovery efforts as we emerge from the crisis into 2021 and beyond. But also the private sector has to play its role in overturning the inequalities in societies that the pandemic often has worsened even further. For example, in Egypt, EBRD has supported the Al-Sawaidi Technical Academy to upgrade their skills development program, with a focus on the industrial engineering and gender equality in line with international standards. Thirdly, one central lesson from the crisis, in my view, is to spare no effort to prevent the next global crisis from happening. I'm certain that we will overcome the coronavirus pandemic, but we already know the next threat, and it's potentially so much larger. I'm talking, of course, about climate change, something no vaccine will ever protect us from, but joint action can and will. That's why green investing is at the heart of this, scaling back on fossil fuel while promoting renewable energy sources, or instilling efficient transportation means, such as spreading the use of rail networks for goods transport. In Egypt, for example, through our ongoing technical assistance to the Egyptian National Railways to restructure its freight business and waste recovery technologies, or through EBRD's investment in the Kitchener Drain Rehabilitation Program. All these are examples of investments that can help mitigate climate change to allow for sustainable growth and the building of green cities. The EBRD strives to be a pioneer in this. We have put green energy at the heart of our mission, and our goal is to become a majority green bank by the end of 2025. But what is true for every person and every state is also true for us. We will only achieve our goal in cooperation and alignment with others. The MDBs have an active role to play here, to lead, stimulate, and impact. Together, we can achieve big things. Your own Benban solar park near Aswan, which I visited last year, is case in point. EBRD financed 16 plants out of a total of 41, delivering 750 megawatt of solar PV capacity, which is more than half of the park's contracted capacity. Benban is expected to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 1.8 million tons a year, equal to eliminating 4.6 coal-fired power plants, or about 400,000 cars. But equally important for us is also to nurture SMEs, the backbone of any sustainable economy. EBRD has to date provided over 2 billion euros to Egyptian banks for on-lending to SMEs. Since the start of the pandemic alone, yes, ladies and gentlemen, since March of this year, EBRD has extended over 700 million in SME and trade finance lines to banks in Egypt to support businesses. And our support to SMEs is not only financial. Through our small business initiative, well over 1,000 advisory services has been provided to SMEs, covering all aspects of business, from HR to operation and marketing. MDBs can capitalize on existing financial system to improve access to funds, but not just funds, knowledge and skills too. In Egypt, for example, we piloted with MBE a youth and skills in business program that can help youth scale up their businesses and SMEs in general to address the systemic issue of retaining skilled labor. But ladies and gentlemen, one development institution working on its own will not help achieve what is needed. MDBs must collaborate as investors and as partners in sharing knowledge, and also as active promoters of good governance. When I prepared for this panel, I read the Arab proverb, a known mistake is better than an unknown truth. I think this must be the spirit in which we work together as partners, advisors, and friends. Our activities are inspired by our shared desire to work as a force for good. We have the tools to build efficient and sustainable markets which can benefit all its participants. The lesson from the coronavirus pandemic is that cooperation is no longer optional, it's indispensable. So we must not waste any time to adapt to this changed environment and learn to make the best of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jürgen. I love that line. No vaccine will protect us from climate change. Only joint action will. That's a great one. I already have a question for you, but I'll hold back on that for now, and we'll go to my friend, Dr. Eric Bergloff. Before I do that, a quick reminder to the audience. We'd like to take questions from the floor, so please use the Q&A button to drop your questions over there. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Eric Bergloff now. Eric is AIIB Chief Economist. He sets the vision and strategy for the Economics Department and leads the planning, implementation, and supervision of its work plan in support of the bank's mandate. He is the first Chief Economist of AIIB. He's a leading economist with significant achievements in economics and international development. Before joining AIIB, he was director of the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics, where I saw him launch the LSE Global Policy Lab extremely successfully, engaging advanced and emerging economies on research-based policy design and implementation. Before that, he was a chief economist at EBRD, and during his tenure, he helped create what's known as the Vienna Initiative, a European crisis response that is credited with mitigating the impact and the fallout of the 2008 global financial crisis. More recently, in 2019, he has served on the high-level wise persons group on European development finance architecture. And in 2017-18, he served as Deputy Secretary of the G20 Eminent Persons Group. Over to you, Eric.
Well, thank you for that very lengthy introduction. You took half of my presentation time, but thank you. It was absolutely delightful to listen to Jürgen here, because I was at the EBRD when we were asked to go into Egypt. And of course, it was something that was completely new and unknown space for us at the time. To hear how much has happened in that very short time period, and how Egypt has become such an important part of what EBRD does. And I think also EBRD has become very important to Egypt. So I was actually going to maybe take up where Jürgen ended. So I was going to say a few words about multilateralism and maybe then come down to where where Jürgen started. What does AIB and what should other IFIs do in Egypt and maybe more widely. I was going to share a little presentation that I prepared, but I think I hope it's visible. Is it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. So as was mentioned, the COVID-19 has clearly been a wake-up call for multilateralism, and as if we probably didn't need to be reminded, but still it's been a very important experience, and I think we have learned a lot, and I will try to come to some of those lessons. This is the growth forecast from the IMF, the October World Economic Outlook, and red here is more than -3% growth, and the orange is 0 to -3%. So you can see that most of the world, and as we mentioned, Egypt is one of the few cases of countries that actually has positive growth. That also includes, of course, China. But it's truly been an unbelievable hit to the world economy, and something that will take a very long time to recover from. And even if we, as we hope, will get the vaccine, it's going to take a long time to distribute that. We will know that we will probably not reach all the world's populations, and some people may not even be willing to take it. So, the COVID will cast a long shadow over the world economy. And, when we talk about multilateralists, so this is, of course, there have been some very fundamental changes in the world. And when we talk about economic diplomacy and reviving multilateralism in the context of Egypt, we have to realize that there has been such fundamental shifts in terms of a multipolar world with new poles of growth, more equal players, more push down towards the regional and the national development institutions away from the global institutions. There have been a lot of new challenges, challenge of completely new scale, new urgency and complexity. And we talked about climate change, but of course we have seen now also what pandemics can do, and there are a number of other such very complex and global challenges. And of course, we are at the same time more interconnected. And of course, we saw from the COVID-19 the extent of interconnectedness, because that made it accelerated the virus that was already very virulent on its own. It spread very quickly. And we also saw that this brought out and reinforced and reminded us of very deep economic, social, and political divides that have grown in recent years. So what it really called for is a new and new inclusive multilateralism that actually delivers. And I think this is where the sort of Egyptian experience is particularly interesting. So I think the lessons we draw is that there's massive cost from the lack of preparedness. There was very clear that some parts of the system were the weakest links. So particularly, I think basic healthcare has become something that we are much more aware now of the weaknesses. It's global, but also here in Asia, very much something that we need to think about. There's a much broader understanding for that we need to build more resilience. We need to be much more aware of the planetary boundaries. We need to collaborate multilaterally on these agreed goals, on the sustainable development goals. And we need to, as we now go into the second phase of the crisis response, it's very unlikely that the development bank will have sufficient resources. Will the IMF have the right tools, the right resources? It's doubtful, and we need to look at that. And because all this needs to translate into a greener and more sustainable recovery. Let me say a few words about the AIB. I'm a newcomer here, of course. I've been here for a month, but I think I view our AIB as part of a new dawn for multilateralism. This was an institution that was shaped by the emerging world in collaboration with advanced economies. It has now 103 shareholders. We've tried to learn from successes and failures of existing institutions, and working very closely with these institutions to raise standards. This concept of lean, green, and clean, or clean, and green has become sort of a motto for the institution. And in the COVID-19 response, it was very quick to, and it predates me, so I can say that as an observer, it was a very impressive, quick response. $13 billion US was put aside for a crisis recovery facility. About half that has been invested. Another 3 billion is in the pipeline, and then thinking about what to do with the rest. But clearly, what we will have to think about is this weakest link, the health sector. We didn't invest anything in the health sector really prior to COVID-19. Suddenly we have now, as I said, this crisis recovery facility. A lot of money went into budget support for health care. We probably won't continue with that type of support, but it's clear that the health sectors around Asia and maybe more widely, it requires a lot of investment. At the same time, we also have to be very much aware of their sustainability. We cannot achieve the sustainable development goals at the expense of financial stability. We know that financial instability, financial crisis can make us lose decades of development. So against that background, what can AIB and Egypt do? Well, Egypt is a founding member of AIB. The portfolio is still very modest compared to what EBRD has established, but it has a 660 million portfolio. We are part of the Ben Ban Solar Park and have 11 projects there. We have a rural sanitation project, working with the National Bank of Egypt on a 200 million liquidity support to reach small and medium-sized enterprises. We know how important it is to get these resources out very widely, and we think National Bank of Egypt has a very interesting network that we can use. They've used it in the past as well. We follow very closely Egypt's very exciting experiments with building integrated green and sustainable cities. And particularly we follow Dr. Rania's very interesting approach to the sustainable development goals. I think these very focused and also evidence-based approach to achieving the sustainable development goals, translating them into things that are actionable at the level of individual cities, individual companies. Also for an institution like AIB, it's very important to be able to measure what we do eventually in how much we are managing to move things towards the sustainable development goals. So again, Egypt is a model for how we should think about multilateralism. So with those words, I wanted to thank you for having me.
Thank you, Eric.
Here is the the greener, more resilient recovery. This is the IMF's forecast for 2021. This, of course, predates the second wave. It's from October, but it's hopefully a more uplifting picture than the one I showed earlier. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see the questions are coming in. I have some as well, and I'll try and combine them as we go along. Let's take one for Dr. Al-Mashat, and the question is from Dina Suleiman. The question is, there seems to be a lot of good things that's happening, and I confess I wasn't aware of many of these things. The question is, if reality is that much better than the perception, what can be done to enhance the image of Egypt?
Well, thank you very much, Dina, and you, Lotfi, for being the perfect candidate, because basically what we're trying to do through this global partnerships narrative is to create a compelling and contemporary way of telling the development story, so that the idea of collaboration with multilateral banks, whether it's AIIB, EBRD, and Egypt has been a founding member at EBRD as well, similar to AIIB. And the point is, how do we go beyond just a number of financing to humanizing this financing? Who are the beneficiaries of these projects? Are these projects sovereign projects only, or are they sovereign with private sector, or are they a private sector only? And which SDGs do they address? So that's why what we are doing now is mapping all our development assistance with all development partners, and we're doing this in collaboration with them so that we can identify, because remember, SDGs were started in 2015, and when the project documents were drafted, there wasn't a particular focus on exactly which SDG is in there. So we're doing this, ex post. And then in the new projects, we're actually doing more effort to ex ante be able to identify them. So first, it's the vacuum that Dina's talking about and that you mentioned is something that I felt as well. I've been a minister in Egypt before, Minister of International Cooperation for 2 years as Minister of Tourism, and I wasn't aware of all these projects. And I wasn't aware of that we have STEM schools for girls, boarding schools for girls from Upper Egypt, and that comes on the basis of a government that has a vision to invest in girls, to invest, to increase their skills, technological skills. That's just one example. When you take a look at BIMBAN, it started with a structural reform related to feed-in tariffs. So the government took that reform, and that opened the potential for IFC, EBRD, for the private sector to come in, and it was part of the very bold subsidy reforms that the government took under with the energy reforms that took place on the fiscal side. So that's why we are putting a lot of effort now on creating the development stories, because development stories are not boring. They're very important. They affect citizens, and they create opportunities for private sector engagement, and they create opportunities for civil society as well. And what is needed and what is happening is that blended finance between multilateral partners, having that ODA as well as also other types of financing come together on different projects is very, very important. So, if it weren't for the delay of Corona, you would have seen more of our narrative out there. But please, I tell Dina to follow us on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, so that you get a flavor of some of these projects documented in different films and so forth. And we are continuing. We have a portfolio of $25 billion across all development partners, both bilateral and multilateral. And it is a fascinating development story.
Excellent. And it's telling that the three principles that you outlined right at the beginning, the third one was about narratives. So clearly it's on the radar. Let me take a question for Mr. Rectoring. The question's from Doa Abdul Munim. How is Egypt expected to benefit from EBRD's new Green Investment Initiative that was approved during the annual meeting in October?
That's a very good question, and someone clearly has some insight. Look, I can dazzle you now with numbers. I can tell you that over the first 8 months, of this year, 9 months actually, EBRD has already invested over 8 billion, more than 30% more than over the same period last year, which was a record number for this year. And I can tell you all other records which we have achieved so far this year. But one thing which we haven't achieved, and now I'm coming to the question, is actually our green financing. Because when we look at the share of green financing this year compared to last year, when 46% was actually green financing, we see that has dropped to below 30%. So this year is an exceptional year in the fact that we always couldn't apply conditionalities to our financing. And it's the same in Egypt. In Egypt, since 2012, we have invested over $5 billion in over 100 projects. But when you look at, and also this year, as I mentioned, to support SMEs, to support the economy, we have already invested over 750 million. But when you look at the green component of this financing, it is far below 10%. So the question is not what can Egypt do? There is no upper limit, there is no cap. We are interested in anything, all good projects which Egypt and its companies bring forward. By the way, something else is also and Dr. Rania already mentioned it, we do see at this point in time still an above average percentage of our investment in government or state-owned enterprises. So also there, I urge all the investors which are currently watching, come to EBRD. Of course, it needs to be bankable, but we are ready to support you, and we don't have any caps whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Eric, a question for you. So I'll have to remind myself that this is a Chamber of Commerce, Business and Investors audience. And the topic is diplomacy, economic diplomacy. And certainly from where I sit here in Singapore, it's obvious that there are certain fault lines on the geopolitical level right now, which is why I guess the change in mindset for diplomacy is being mooted. The question from an investor's perspective is, how serious are the geopolitical fault lines, or should we just ignore those and look at the investment, business and financing opportunities?
Well, I think they're very serious, of course. And if you look at what happened now in the COVID-19 crisis, you know, there was this shock to the system and to the global value chains to trade. It has actually recovered remarkably quickly, in part because a lot of that recovery happened in China, which is a little bit ahead of the world in terms of the cycle, and had, you know, got this kind of control relatively quickly. So, but it basically means that we are back more or less to where it was when COVID-19 hit. But of course, what hasn't gone away was the geopolitical dimension, and of course COVID-19 brought out that geopolitical tension, and I think that is hovering over the whole global system, and the idea that we somehow would split up the world in two or more camps that would have parallel production systems and so on. I think that is a very frightening prospect for anyone who thinks about, you know, the global system and about multilateralism. So I think it certainly is there, and it's something that I think these multilateral institutions have with, you know, very important responsibility to try to fight against, because it is, you know, we have such important challenges to address together. We talked about climate, we talked about pandemic preparedness, all those things. We are much better equipped if we can work together, if we have a, you know, efficient global system that for production and of goods and services, but also for information exchange and all those things. So yes, I'm very worried about this. In fact, it's, I think, part of the reason why I'm sitting here in Beijing, that if I can be part of this in any way to try to prevent that from happening, that would be very meaningful.
Great, thank you. Let's take another question for Dr. Al-Mashat. This is from Sameh Gabra. How can we position Egypt to compete for the China +1 strategy? Do we need legislations, strategies, roadshows? I guess, how do you bring business, manufacturing, and so on into Egypt if there is a global shift of manufacturing facilities happening right now?
You know, I mean, Egypt's foreign policy has been one which is very balanced. So if you take a look, you will find that in our new cities, for instance, China does play an investment role. If you take a look at some of the transportation, very important transportation projects, there are very important investments there as well as other investments from different countries. So we have not been, geared towards one versus the other. And I think how we economically try to portray this is, as both very distinguished speakers showed, Egypt has potential. And it's not potential just in the rhetoric. It's potential that has been realized in terms of projects on the ground. And whether it's development partners that are talking about these projects, or private sector that has actually also participated in BEBA or participated in different agricultural projects, etc. All of them have been quite successful. Scale makes a difference. The ability to actually be in an area that you can, you're a gateway to Africa, you are important in the region. We have very important deals when it comes to petroleum and natural gas, electricity transmission channels with Africa and Europe. So there's this mix of sectoral offerings, if you will. And the government has not been only doing it by itself, but we have the credible institutions that are putting or voting with their financing, which is extremely important. And number two is that as the world is changing and everybody's talking about a new normal, I mean, of course, notwithstanding the vaccine that just came out yesterday, I think that, we cannot think of comparative advantages for countries the same way we did before 2020. I think countries that are going to be sort of post-pandemic stories are ones that were more stakeholder engaging and ones that were more committed to their SDG and development agenda. So that's how you distinguish yourself, in my view. And that's what the Egyptian government was very keen on. Reforms continued, our partners continued, like for instance, Egypt in 2020 with our international partners, we were able to finance on development finance around $7.5 billion. That's not a small amount of money. And when we take a look at the sectors, their health, their transportation, their social solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, the private sector through SME financing and so forth. So I would say that, that we have a very important on the ground story to portray and just continue doing more of what we're doing.
Thank you. Closer to my time zone, Japan has rolled out an incentive program for companies to leave China, up to 50 of those, not just to go back to Japan, but also to go to third countries. Thailand has also rolled out incentive packages for manufacturing to come in the current environment. Should I take this question for Mr. Richterink, if you would like to answer this, which is, are there global examples of getting mid-sized companies, so not just the big ones, the mid-sized companies to deliver green or net zero emissions that Egyptian companies might emulate, as action needs to happen at all levels?
Are there mid-sized companies? It is indeed true that many of the FDIs in countries like Egypt, but beyond, are done by larger multinationals. When you look at mid-sized companies, what companies usually require is a stable and reliable investment climate. And to be honest, I think Egypt has been working on this for the past many years. We've seen, and Dr. Rania already mentioned that, extensive reform program. We've seen significant investments in infrastructure upgrade over the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. And that has created, and this is maybe an MDB term, but like an enabling environment. And that has led to, let's say, a much more stable macroeconomic environment, flexible exchange rate, reduced inflation, reducing interest rate. So this all are enabling factors. And it is very logical that first the large companies invest and then the smallest. In terms of maybe one more thing on the green financing, we sometimes forget that green financing is not only the right thing to do, but also the most economic thing to do. And actually, to be honest, if I would be a business owner, I would also look at the economics, of course. When we look at examples like Ben Ban, but also in Jordan and other countries, actually, when you look at the price able to achieve with solar plant, it's far below any conventional fossil fuel energy production. So it's not only the enabling environment, it's also because over the last few years, we've seen technologies evolve, and now it has become more economical as well.
Thank you. And when you mentioned that you had already committed 700 million to SMEs in Egypt, that was a completely new information for me. I certainly wasn't aware of that.
That is only, this is only particular this year. But as a development bank, we do have boots on the ground, as we call it. We do have very strong local offices. In Egypt, we have specialists there on the advisory for small businesses, so who are working with SMEs. But to do real financing to smaller and medium-sized businesses, you need to have an extensive network. So what we typically do is actually we work with partner banks, and we have many of these banks in Egypt. We provide them with a financing line, and actually they then on-lend it to the SMEs, because you once in a while need to kick the tires, meaning you need to be really truly on the ground to do that.
Great. So I have one last question. Let's take the last question remaining from the chat room, from Sheriff Zaki. I assume it's addressed to Dr. Rania. COVID-19 was clearly unexpected, may have thrown us off course, but to be fully prepared for the future, what are the main aspects of our economic development plan to mitigate expected downturns?
I would say reform, reform, reform. You know, all of us, whether citizens, policymakers, business owners, women, men, young, old, everybody has been tested. And I think everybody rose to the plate to a large extent. And the sense that no one can do it by themselves, this concept of isolation and every country on its own, I think there is that rhetoric, of course, but I believe that it's only through collaboration and cooperation. Everyone has a place at the table. Jürgen had mentioned shared experience, but also there have been failures that you bring to the table and you discuss and you want to avoid going forward. So, you know, we were very lucky with the pandemic because we had technology. If we have a technology crisis or a cyber attack that, you know, and you and I were on a panel with WEF when it came to societal risk. I think the two crises that we have not yet witnessed as a globe are cyber crises or a very big climate crisis. So I think those aside, if anything else, God forbid, happens, I believe we can actually continue to work together, build back better, be more inclusive, and actually have all stakeholders together on the table.
Great. So I have a last question for Eric, and then one question for everyone, and I'll tell you what that one question for everyone will be before I ask Eric a question. The last question I wanted everyone to, the message to leave us with is, given that this is a business audience, from your vantage point, as facilitators of business. What is it that what's a positive message that you'd like to send them? But more importantly, what is the one thing that you would like to get back from business? What is the mindset change that you would like to see amongst private sector businesses and investors? But before that, Eric, my question for you, this can be very general, doesn't have to be Egypt specific, is to do with public-private partnership, where the invitation is for the private sector to work with the public sector and maybe also the social sector. But in practice, what sometimes happens is that you have a pacing problem or a capacity mismatch on different sides, and you get potentially frustrations. It's like a multiplayer game when one side has latency issues or low connectivity issues, and it may ruin the game for everyone. How is it in countries where they do public-private partnership well? How do they get forward movement?
It's a big question, and I think a very important one. There are so many examples, unfortunately, of failed public-private partnership, also in Egypt for that matter. I remember traveling around some of the less developed areas of Cairo and seeing these canisters or used for garbage collection being as some part of some public partnership and being used to make statues of and so on. It was clearly a failed effort, and there are unfortunately many examples of that around the world, and it has to do with what you're alluding to. They are often not very balanced in the sense that these operators come and they have experience from maybe hundreds of projects, and they work with local authorities and sometimes central governments that have limited experience. Egypt has built a PPP unit. I think I presume it's still around, and it was only there when I was more active in Egypt. But I think that's a very important part. You have to have local knowledge and in place. But here, I think the multilateral development banks are absolutely critical, because they can help both be sort of a balancing force in these relationships. They can help the public part of this to make it a more balanced relationship. They can help to mitigate conflicts that almost always arise. I remember when I came to EBRD, one of the first things I did was to look at do an inventory of all the PPPs that we had done at the time. I think it was 26, and every single one of them had been renegotiated at least once. So these are very difficult things to, and of course they run over a long period of time, and things change, and political majority changes. So these are complex things. I think they're extremely important to get to work, because it's very important for the government to have that interaction with the private sector, to be challenged by the private sector, to pick up the skills of the private sector, but also to bring the private sector into, we see the positive side of the private sector. Of course, there are also examples of the private sector has been less helpful in feeding corruption and so on. So I think it's extremely important that these relationships work. And of course, it's not just the extreme private, these PPPs, but it's also everything in between, which are collaborations between the private and public sector. So yes, I think this is very important, something that we should put much more attention to, I think, and again, the importance of the MDBs is critical.
Okay, thank you so much, and we've come to the end of our time. But before we leave, one round of last messages, particularly for the private sector. Should we start with Jürgen? Would you like to go first?
I always was taught ladies first, but I do my best.
I want to end with her. So,
no, in terms of mindset change, I would like to stress the need to address inequality, also from the private sector. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was said COVID is the same for all. It's not. It's different for countries. We've discussed this. Egypt comes out better than others. It's different for certain age groups. The older are different affected than the younger, but also for the poor and the rich. So, by the way, it's also a cause for populism. So that would be my first message. And the second, and then I really stop, embrace diversity, because that is very important in all decision making anyhow. Thank you.
Eric?
I would like to say that resilience is a word that has to be in the DNA of businesses, governments, and this pandemic has shown us that there are certain risk mitigation tools or risk mitigation policies that we need to all take seriously. And as a previous minister of tourism, I've seen Egyptian private sector firms be able to weather storms and shocks of different nature in a very, I would say, very representative fashion. So I have a lot of faith in Egypt's private sector. And what everybody needs to be looking at are the fundamental, I would say, environments that provide for more expansions of activity, given the population size, given the diversified nature of the economy, and given the needs that this economy needs going forward. So on that note, I would say definitely, as Eric mentioned and Jürgen mentioned, private-public engagement, discussion is very, very important, whether it's through a PPP unit or otherwise. And that's why when you take a look at our standby agreement with the IMF, you will find that there are structural reforms that address competition, address certain legislation that will make private sector work more conducive and easier, or enabling, as Jürgen mentioned.
Thank you. Eric, you have the last word.
Well, I was going to pick up where Jürgen started or ended. I think what the COVID-19 has really brought out are these deep inequalities, and if anything, COVID-19 has further worsened them. And what I think, particularly in the Egyptian context, is the thinking about the equality of opportunities and creating opportunities for young people to be part of the recovery, to be feeling that they are providing meaningful, have meaningful jobs, and that they are building a future and can develop as individuals. I think, and again, diversity. That this should be applied to anyone independently of which gender, which ethnic minority, or which part of the country they come from. That is so essential, and so that would be the mindset, the equality of opportunity mindset, I think is what I would like to see more.
Excellent. On that happy note, we bring this to an end. I'd like to thank the panelists. I certainly learned much, so thank you very much for that. And of course, thank you to our audience. Thank you, and we bring this to a close now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for moderating. Thank you, Eric.
Finally, on behalf of BEBA, I'd like to thank Her Excellency for joining us, the panelists, the moderator, and all the attendees. Thank you for your support, Your Excellency, and thank you, panelists. And it's been a very informative panel. Thank you very much.
Shukran.
Thank you. Happy car ride.